If you were to time travel and tell me back in 2008 that Iron Man was just the beginning, I probably wouldn't have believed you. You see, back in the day, the idea of a shared universe on film, it wasn't a brand new idea, but it isn't as popular as it is today because, well, nobody realized it could make a ton of money, and that's why Iron Man started off as this sort of indie film. It wasn't trying to connect to other movies, nor was it trying to build up a universe, at least until the post-credit scene. This movie is truly a solo movie. It starts off as just Iron Man. He's the only superhero around here. And while later MCU films will retcon it so that there are other superheroes that existed long before Iron Man, this movie does not make any references to that. This movie just wants to tell the story it needs to tell about Tony Stark. And in my opinion, Iron Man is the best Marvel Cinematic Universe movie ever. And yeah, it is true. Now we're in the future. We have Avengers Infinity War, Endgame, No Way Home, Guardians of the Galaxy. And I'm not trying to say that those movies are bad in any way. They all have their strengths. But what makes Iron Man so special is that when you compare it to all the other future MCU movies, Iron Man is, well, the best way to describe it is simple. Iron Man isn't trying to be a grander scope movie. It is rather a simple film that tells a simple story. And yet, that's why it's the best MCU film, because sure, all of the other MCU films are bigger and larger, but because of Iron Man's simplicity, the story is much more smoother and simpler, and a lot easier to relate to. Maybe that's why Iron Man is the best MCU film. It's just trying to be a superhero movie. While every other MCU film is obviously a superhero film, they always try to set up a larger universe, set up future films, and I can understand that. They're trying to make money, so I'm not gonna hassle on it, but Iron Man's simplicity and its ability to not milk sequels, at least until the post-credit scene, is what makes it so much more refreshing, even though this movie came out years ago. And in all that time, in all the years that have gone by, none of the MCU films have really surpassed Iron Man. And I feel like there's a good reason for that. When Iron Man first started, there was a reason they were making this movie. At the time, Marvel was going bankrupt, or at least they weren't making as much money as they used to, and so they were trying to find ways to make their characters popular, and so they began their own studio to make those Marvel movies. Unfortunately, most of their popular characters were licensed out to other studios, so they couldn't make movies about X-Men or Spider-Man, but they still had the rights to the core members of the Avengers like Iron Man, Ant-Man, and Hulk and Thor. And so, Marvel Studios was born, and they had the ambitious plan to truly adapt the comic books by making a shared universe on screen. And so they began with Iron Man, who at the time was more of a B or C list character that not a lot of people really liked. And so, in order to make a successful cinematic universe, they had to do Iron Man right, because otherwise, the universe would just be doomed. And you all know the rest. Iron Man became a success, it launched the Marvel Cinematic Universe, the rest is history. And with all that backstory said, I think that's the reason why Iron Man is such a great film and the best MCU film. Pretty much every single MCU film after Iron Man was a product. Now, I'm not saying that's a bad thing, or that every MCU film is bad or inferior because they are products, but what I mean by that is that every other MCU film doesn't seem to have the same sort of passion that Iron Man had. With Iron Man, it was made on a much more smaller budget, it was made with more practical effects. It just feels like this movie was made to be, well, a movie rather than a product in a line of Marvel movies that tell stories that build up on other stories to make even more money. This does not feel like any of that. Iron Man genuinely feels like it's trying to be a movie. Let's think about the plot for a minute here. The plot isn't about Tony Stark forming the Avengers or building up to a future film, but rather it's just Tony Stark being, well, a genius billionaire playboy philanthropist who doesn't really care about where his weapons are being distributed until he gets kidnapped by the 10 Rings. The weapons he was making to protect the world are now being used by terrorist organizations to destroy it. And to make things worse, those weapons almost killed Tony Stark himself if it weren't for the arc reactor that was implanted into his chest. Tony realizes the damage he's causing to the world, but he is not a bad person, and so he's going to do something about it. But first he needs to get out of the cave, and so, using the arc reactor he made, he he built a metal suit to escape, powered up by the arc reactor. As soon as Tony gets back to Malibu, he announces that he's shutting down weapons manufacturing for Stark Industries. His company has to do better, and in future MCU films, the direction the company takes is a lot more technological advancements and stuff like that, so I guess in the end it paid off. But what Tony really wanted to do was improve the suit that he had made back when he escaped the cave. He does some tinkering, he does some rocket science, until eventually he makes the Iron Man suit we all know and love today. It doesn't really have any of the same colorings though, as this was the Mark II. The Mark II was fine, I guess, but it does have some flaws, and those flaws needed to be improved in order to be, well, a superhero basically. And that right there is Tony Stark's biggest motivation for the entire film. He wants to do better, and sometimes you just gotta do things yourself, and so he becomes the superhero Iron Man to help protect those who probably otherwise wouldn't be able to protect themselves. It's a simple origin story, and yet that's why it works. We get to see the journey that Tony Stark goes through to become Iron Man, to become better than who he was before. And while future MCU films do have a lot of heart in their stories, the simplicity of Iron Man makes it have the biggest heart of them all. It's not a movie featuring a group of superheroes and then just have the titled character be a side character. No, this movie is an Iron Man movie, and so the story is about Iron Man. That's not to say that there weren't any other characters in the movie. There's the famous Pepper Potts, who's Tony Stark's girlfriend. Well, not in this movie, she's just the assistant, but they do have some chemistry together, and those moments are really sweet and do hint at a larger romance that will play later on in the MCU. Now, admittedly, Pepper isn't a strong, independent female like she becomes later on. She does serve the role of the love interest at the end of the day. But despite her role in the story, she does have a personality that makes her memorable. She's funny, she's stern, and she does look like she's the responsible type of woman, and she cares a lot for Tony Stark, even if she can be a bit harsh on him. So despite being a love interest, she works. Sometimes you don't need to be a strong, independent female to just be a great character. There's also James Lieutenant Rhodes, otherwise known as Rhodey, who doesn't become War Machine in this movie, and he's played by a different actor. Admittedly, Rhodey in this movie isn't really serving all that much in the plot. He's mainly there just to be Tony Stark's best friend, but that's not a bad thing. He's still got a lot of personality, and unfortunately Terrence Howard never becomes War Machine because he gets replaced by Don Cheadle in all the future movies. And, Don Cheadle looks nothing like Terrence Howard, so that's awkward. But what a lot of people don't seem to realize is that Iron Man has a really great villain. Now, admittedly, Obadiah Stane doesn't have like a deep backstory as to why he became a villain, but he doesn't need to. He's a greedy man who wants to become a warmonger, like an ironmonger, really. He's cunning, he's smart, he's got a great personality that he uses to manipulate people, but deep down, he's a monster. And honestly, Obadiah is pretty scary. He's actually more scary as a person than he is when he's wearing the Ironmonger suit. There's a scene in the movie where Pepper is downloading all of the evidence to Obadiah's criminal acts, and Obadiah comes into the room just as she's doing that. And the scene is just very tense. It's like, is he gonna discover what she's doing? What will happen to her if he does? Ooh, it's actually really tense and genuinely scary. This guy is a villain. And honestly, I miss the days where villains don't really have all that much of a backstory, and instead we're just villains because they have a much more evil and ambitious goal. I mean, I appreciate all of the villains that have all the sympathetic backstories that make them great characters, but sometimes you just want a villain because, well, he's a villain for the hell of it, because sometimes those are the best kinds. The characters are great, the story is great, the cinematography is great, and the special effects are also well done. I can't believe some of it is actually CGI and not a practical suit that they built. Yeah, they did some really good VFX for this movie. Why does the VFX in this movie look better than in future MCU films? Maybe it's because the VFX in this movie were actually, well, you know, effort was put into them rather than just using it for a cheap product. In general, a lot of effort was made to make this movie great. The story was written so that all of the characters' motivations are correct, they make sense, everything is done so well. The story of Iron Man is about Tony Stark, a man who has everything and yet he still has nothing. He's just a billionaire playboy philanthropist who sells weapons and makes money, but then he realizes that all of that is contributing to problems around the world and that he isn't doing enough to help the world. And so with all of his technology, with all of his intelligence, he decides to do good with the world by becoming a superhero and help those in need. This movie does a great job capturing that story on screen. Iron Man really is a great movie, and it is the best MCU film to date. No other Marvel movie can surpass this simple, yet well-meaning and well-done film. If I were to give Iron Man a rating, I'd give it 9 stars out of 10. It's not a perfect movie, but then again, no movie is. At least it's near perfect in that it gets everything it wants to do right, and because of that, it launched a whole new universe. We love you 3000, man.